I'll just give a quick introduction because it's 9 o'clock now, and after that Craig will begin. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today for today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. This is Assessing Speaking, how to reduce some of the challenges of evaluating your learners. And this is presented by Craig Thaine. I'm Simon Wright, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleague Jade. And during the webinar, you'll be able to hear Craig and to see Craig's slides, but you won't be able to see Craig. There's no webcam involved. And you don't need a microphone, but as I just mentioned before, if you want to ask a question, then please use the questions box, and we'll make sure that we put questions to Craig at the end of the presentation. And a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you by email in a few days' time. What you'll have is a certificate of attendance along with a recording link to watch again. So that will be sent to you soon. So let me just introduce Craig briefly. So I'm very pleased to welcome Craig Thaine. He's done at least several webinars with us before. And Craig is co-author of Cambridge English in Power. And Craig has been involved in ELT for 30 years. And he's Cambridge DTE FLA qualified and also has an MA Honours in Applied Linguistics. He's worked as a teacher and a teacher trainer in many countries, including England, Italy, Egypt, Sweden, and New Zealand. And he is Director of Teacher Training at Languages International Auckland and is a Cambridge English Language Assessment Teaching Awards Assessor for both the CELTA and the Delta schemes. Craig has an extensive experience developing and teaching English language courses to adult learners, including ESP and EAP courses. And Craig is co-author of Real Listening and Speaking, as well as being author of Teacher Training Essentials and Cambridge Academic English, that's the intermediate level. And his publications include Real Listening and Speaking 2, Teacher Training Essentials, and Cambridge Academic English, and that's co-authored with Martin Hewing. So plenty of experience there, I think you can see. So over to you, Craig. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you for everyone who has joined the webinar. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. So I'm based in Auckland, and I will say good evening because it's the evening here, but I imagine for a lot of you it's probably good morning or good afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and I hope that I can share some ideas with you that might be useful, particularly looking at this issue of how we assess the speaking of our learners. And what I'm trying to do is kind of look at some of the issues and then also look at a very practical idea that hopefully will make it a little bit easier for you. So what I'd like to do is in the webinar, we're going to look at the importance of testing learners' oral competence, why we need to do it, why it's important. We'd also look at the reasons for this kind of assessment, why we need to do it. I want to make a comparison between what I call classroom-based and then more formal assessment. And this will lead on to looking a little bit at something that I've touched on before in previous webinars called learning-oriented assessment. We'll then analyze what goes into speaking, what are the different sort of competencies, what's involved, and then towards the end I want to look at the application of learning-oriented assessment principles to maybe a more traditional assessment scenario, and in doing so, that's where I want to kind of share an idea that I tried with my learners here in Auckland recently, in the hope that it will give you some ideas and perhaps make things a little bit easier. So why is the assessment of speaking important? If we look at this quote from Go and Burns, I think that they kind of sum it up quite well. So I'll just read it aloud so that it also gives you time to process it. The testing of speaking skills has become increasingly important, not only because progress and achievement need to be recorded within educational institutions, but also because certain levels of language skills may be required for progression into further study and or employment. So what this is signaling is that a lot of our learners are learning English because they want to use English in order to perhaps do some academic study in English, either in their home country or in an English-speaking country, or perhaps they want to get a job where an ability to speak English well is important. So therefore, having some kind of proof or evidence that you can speak English well, employers or maybe universities will want this. So it's no longer good enough just to say, I speak English well as a learner. They will sort of say, okay, well, how well do you speak English? And they will want some evidence. So in order to provide that kind of evidence, that means the oral competence of students needs to be assessed in some way. So I'm not sure if you can actually communicate with each other, but I'm just curious to find out with this very simple task, how frequently do you assess your learners speaking? So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see your answers. If you are typing them into the question box, they are not appearing for me. So, but that's okay. I'm sure you're answering. But anyway, the three options there are all situations that I have been in myself, where I've only had to assess the speaking of learners at the end of a course. In some institutions, I've had to do it 2 or 3 times during a course. There was one instance when I was doing an EAP course where I was assessing students speaking all the time and kind of every 2 weeks. So of those first 3 options, the first 3 of them are all things that I have done. So if we look at the next task, why do you assess your learners speaking? And again, if you could type your answers, they don't seem to be coming up, but that's okay. Maybe you can share them with each other. There are different choices here. You might decide to assess your speakers to find out if they've passed the course or not. You might use it to decide if they can go to a higher level. You may want to give a grade. You want to monitor their progress. You might want to work out their future learning needs, or there could be another reason. But I suspect, although I can't see your answers, I suspect that probably some of you are typing more than one answer. And what this signals, of course, is the fact that when we do assess our learners speaking, we've probably got 1 or 2 agendas. It's not just simply one agenda. So let's sum up these points. If we look at the when, there could be different times when we assess learners, and that could be to do with what their expectations and needs are. So recently at my school, we sort of consulted with students to find out whether we should assess them a little bit less, but we currently do it every 4 weeks, and we sort of suggested maybe they'd like to be assessed only every 6 weeks, and they said no. They were quite clear about that. So they have an expectation that they want some kind of assessment and some kind of feedback on their speaking on a regular basis. Also, learners' needs. We may perceive a need, but we want to actually put students in a kind of an assessment scenario in order to more clearly determine what their needs are. Now, the type of course that you are teaching, that might have an influence of how often you assess learners. So if you're teaching a general English course, and there are no kind of examinations, it's a fairly kind of relaxed learning environment, you may not need to assess your learners speaking so much. However, if your learners are doing some kind of examination course or a course that leads to a specific kind of achievement test of some kind, well, then you may want to assess their speaking far more regularly. Institutional requirements may play a role. So your university or your institute may say, we want you as a teacher to assess your learners speaking on a monthly basis. So you must do it every month. And there could be some kind of compliance associated with that. So, for example, your institution perhaps belongs to an organization, which is sort of a body of English or second language schools, and that organization might say that all students in our schools need to be assessed once every 6 weeks, for example. So that's what I would call a compliance requirement. So in terms of looking at the when we assess students, some of it is to do with the learners and their expectations, but there could be these kind of institutional requirements and in the nature of the course itself. Then if we're thinking about why, we clearly, obviously, as teachers, we're always keen to monitor the progress of our students and find out how they're going. What are their, are their speaking skills developing? Are they making progress in this area? We may want to determine their needs to find out what their strengths and weaknesses are. So in terms of speaking, we might sort of think, they're quite fluent in terms of their speaking, but maybe they've got some problems with pronunciation. So we're trying to determine those kinds of needs. There could be a what I call a gatekeeping function. So, an example of this, a very simple example of this is something like IELTS. So to go to a lot of universities or join specific university courses here in New Zealand, often students need to have a certain IELTS level, and there could even be a requirement that the speaking, the score for their speaking in IELTS needs to be at a certain level. And if they achieve that score, the gate is open to them. If they don't achieve that score, the gate is closed. So that's what I mean by a gatekeeping function. But also often in schools that I've worked at over the years, students often come to you as the teacher and say, I want to go up to the next level. This is too easy. The grammar is very easy. And maybe that student is very good at doing grammar tests, but the reasons they're not in a higher level is because their spoken ability is not good enough for them to move up. So again, you're using the speaking test as a gatekeeping function in terms of sort of saying, yes, you can go up to the next level, or no, you can't. You may assess a learner's speaking to indicate a level of achievement. So that you've managed to complete this course and you can do these particular tasks, and you may provide some kind of report that indicates that, or you may want to indicate a level of competence. And then often the level of confidence often these days is pegged to the CEFR levels, the Council of Europe, A1 through to the C2. So you may be doing some kind of speaking assessment in order to determine what the learner's level of competence is so that you can give this to them. Now, we're going to move to another task. Again, I don't think I'll be able to see your answers. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to think about it, and then we'll look at the answers together. So what you can see on the right-hand side is there are different features of assessment. Now, 3 of these I would associate with classroom-based assessment, whereas 3 of them I would associate with formal assessment. But they are similar, okay? They're both similar. So to do an example with you, I would say that a checklist of language items is very, very similar to F, criteria for grading. So I would associate a checklist of language items to be connected to classroom-based assessment. And I would say that criteria for grading I would associate with formal assessment. So they make a pair. So just have a go and see if you can make 2 more pairs. And I'll just pause for a minute to give you a time to do that. Again, I'm sorry, I can't see your answers, but that's okay. I've got the answers to show you. So just think of B, C, D, and E. What 2 pairs can you make?
I could just read a few out for you, Craig, actually, because I can see them.
Oh, cool.
As they come in, yeah. So if people want to type in, I can just read some of them out quickly. Okay, we've got B and D, C and E.
Mm-hmm.
B and D again. D, E, B, C. B, D, C, E. C and E. I'll just do a few more. C and D. So there's a few different responses.
Different responses.
A and E. B and D, C and E. Is that fine?
Yeah, no, that's great. So actually, a lot of you, it seems like a lot of you have chosen B and D and C and E, and that they're the ones that I would actually put together. So at the top, the first one is what I would associate with classroom-based assessment, and then the one below it that's in italics, so D, I would associate with formal assessment. Now, if they're not entirely clear, these ideas, don't worry. I'm actually going to tease them out and talk about them in a lot more detail. So this is just kind of, this task was just a kind of a very quick thing to get you kind of thinking about some of these issues a little bit, but I am going to explain them in a lot more detail as we go through. And in fact, I've created a summary here, but I've added two more features. So the last two, oral and written feedback associated with classroom-based assessment, and then formal assessment. Often you might give oral written feedback, but also there could be a grade and/or certificate. So what I'm going to do is look at some of these differences between formal assessment and classroom-based assessment, but in fact there are also some similarities. So at the end of this process, we'll also look at what is similar between these two, because there is some overlap. So we're going to start with formal assessment, and I'm going to go through each feature and tease out what exactly I mean by that. So starting with assessment specification. So this is a feature of formal assessment. So the kind of questions that a test writer might ask herself is, what exactly is being assessed? What is the construct? What activities and tasks will be used? How will they be weighted? So do we give more emphasis to accuracy and maybe less emphasis to fluency, or the other way around? That's what I mean by weighting, the kind of emphasis you give to one aspect of spoken language or another. What criteria will be used and how will students be scored? Okay, the criteria, a test writer will think, okay, what knowledge and skills will be evaluated? How do they relate to the course objectives? How do they relate to oral language competence? How clear are they to teachers and students? So the last point I think is actually quite important. If someone is writing an informal speaking test and you're writing criteria with which you're going to evaluate students, they do need to be clear to teachers, but also to the students who are being evaluated. So when we're talking about formal assessment, we use the terms interlocutor and rater. So the interlocutor is the person who asks students questions in a speaking test. And then the rater is the person who actually is evaluating and applying the assessment criteria and deciding how well or how badly the student is doing. So are they the same person or are they two different people? So for example, in Cambridge main suite exams, there is an interlocutor and there is a rater. So the interlocutor asks the questions to the students in the speaking test, and the rater is listening only and evaluating. However, in IELTS, the interlocutor and the rater are the same person. So the person asking the questions is also making the evaluation at the same time. A key issue here is how reliable are the judgments, particularly of the person who is rating the student, and what kind of standardization do they go? So I know I'm not an IELTS examiner myself, but I have friends who are IELTS examiners, and I think they undergo standardization every year. So that's important to make sure that their judgments are reliable. So Formal assessment will often result in a grade or a certificate. So does this relate to a specific level of competence? For example, as I mentioned before, the CEFR. Is the student above or below a specified level? And it could be a level within the school. Do they receive some kind of evidence of their ability? Okay, so some kind of certificate, a piece of paper. If we think back right to the very beginning with this, the idea that assessment of speaking is important because it can mean that you get a better job if you can speak English well. Well, therefore, this kind of evidence is going to be very important. And then is there some kind of external validation of the certificate? So is the certificate just something that the institution has created, or is there a body, an authorizing body that has actually validated the certificate in the same way? So these are kinds of questions that people who are writing formal assessments need to ask themselves. Let's now move on and look at classroom-based assessment. And this perhaps, given I imagine that a lot of you are teachers, this is perhaps a little bit closer to your own experience in terms of conducting speaking tests. So you will be thinking about, okay, a range of speaking tasks. So which spoken genre will you get students to perform in the speaking test? So will they do a role play? Will they do a discussion, a monologue, or will they do one of each? So you'll also think about what interaction these tasks should encompass. So will students work in pairs or groups or alone, or all of these? You probably would go into a speaking test with a kind of a checklist. You may not have it written down, it might just be in your head, but you'll be thinking about language that you previously taught and you want to be sure that students are actually using it. Will the students use the language that I aim to teach later on? So you're kind of making a diagnosis if you're thinking along those lines. So you want to see, if they actually can produce that language already. And you might be not just looking for grammar and vocabulary, but you might be seeing how students actually use different kind of speaking strategies like turn taking or interrupting, things like that. Then as a teacher, you are evaluating and often making a diagnosis of your students' needs. So what do you hear? Do you note down errors? Or do you write down good examples of language use as well as errors? What can you do with this, with what you hear? Do you give immediate feedback? Do you do error correction? Or do you just make a note? So, I mean, for example, if you're kind of doing a speaking activity in which students should have been using the present perfect and nobody was using the present perfect, maybe you won't say anything at that point, but just make a mental note and think, okay, I need to revise that in a subsequent lesson. Then the kind of feedback that you might give to learners. So what should you include in your feedback? Strengths as well as needs. Do you give feedback to the group as a whole? You might say, okay, you are all using modal verbs very, very well, or you're all very fluent in the way that you spoke in the discussion. Or should you, as a result of having carried out this speaking test, should you perhaps do some kind of report or a tutorial? Okay, so I hope that this gives a clearer idea of these features of assessment. And as I said, although they're different, there are a lot of similarities. So for example, the speaking tasks that a teacher uses might actually be very, very similar to speaking activities or tasks that are used in a more formal assessment specification. The other thing is that when you are carrying out a speaking test in your classroom-based assessment, you may in fact be using assessment criteria. So you may be working at a school that provides you with assessment criteria that they want you to use when you are assessing students speaking. A rater, someone who's evaluating students in a formal assessment, may in fact be listening for similar kind of language features as you are listening for in your classroom-based assessment. And your feedback to learners may in fact include a grade. You might have, so at your institution, you might have some kind of scoring mechanism in which, you know, students, the perfect score is 25 and students will get a score like 17 out of 25. Okay, so there are a lot of similarities and a certain amount of overlap between formal assessment and classroom-based assessment, but also there are some differences. So I think this is in terms of formal assessment, this quote from Luoma's book on assessing speaking. And she says, specifications contain the developer's definition of constructs assessed in the test and the detailed definitions of the tasks and the delivery of fair ratings. The specification record the rationale for why the assessment focuses on certain constructs and how tasks and criteria operationalize them. Okay, so in effect, what she's saying here is an informal assessment, our point of departure needs to be a very detailed written specification of the test. And what this quote is indicating is that a test writer needs to think this through. Okay, so this to me suggests a level of sophistication and complexity. And this kind of complexity and sophistication is really important when you have got exams like IELTS, Cambridge Main Suite, and even end of course achievement tests when you're making sort of quite critical decisions about what happens to the student next, whether they go up a grade or whether they get a certificate with a certain grade on it. So tests of this nature need to be valid and reliable. And in order for them to be valid and reliable, you need to go through that rather sophisticated and not straightforward, I have to say, process of drawing up a test specification and checking it through. So the development of a test, of a formal assessment, is quite complex. And I think that, you know, it does require a certain degree of expertise. Over the years, I've worked in schools where there are usually 2 or 3 teachers who are very, very interested in assessment and in fact are very good at developing expertise. And often they collaborate together and can come up with some very, very good tests. But there are a lot of teachers who are like myself, who, I mean, I understand the issues, but I'm not very good at actually putting them into practice in terms of writing tests that are very reliable and valid. And I see that very much as being the work of test item writers. However, as a teacher, I actually do have confidence in terms of my classroom-based assessment of learners speaking. I feel comfortable about working with a group of learners, going into a classroom and kind of evaluating their assessment. So that's what I want to put a focus on for the rest of the webinar, is looking at what I think is perhaps more central to teachers' concerns, and that is classroom-based assessment. Now, this classroom-based assessment has had in the literature various labels. It's been called classroom-based assessment. It's also been called assessment for learning, dynamic assessment, but the term that I will be using is learning-oriented assessment, LOA. So a question that people have is, are classroom-based assessment and formative assessment the same thing? The answer to that is they can be, but not really. So classroom-based assessment can be both formative and summative. So if you're doing an assessment of speaking at a kind of a mid-course point where you're trying to sort of see how much learners have learned, what their needs are, how things are going, that's more formative. If you're doing it at the end of a course to actually find out what they've achieved in terms of developing their speaking skills, well then that is obviously more summative. So really the distinction here depends entirely on you, the teacher's purpose in carrying out the assessment. So whether it's formative or summative depends on why you're doing the assessment, what is your reason. And that is the key distinction, I think. So Jones and Saville, who have written a lot about learning-oriented assessment, they make what I think is in effect a more useful distinction, which I've really been making so far in the webinar, and that is a distinction between classroom-based assessment and formal large-scale assessment. And they also note that they should contribute for the two key purposes of assessment, and that is to provide evidence of learning and to provide evidence for learning. So the difference is all in those two prepositions. So evidence of learning is what you've taught students already, and evidence for learning is listening to what language students are producing and determining what their needs are. So if we look at learning-oriented assessment, it is more focused, I think, on evidence for learning. It's more diagnostic, and therefore is oriented towards future learning. The other key issue is that it sees assessment as being far more integrated into the learning process. So rather than being, okay, we've got teaching and then we've got the test, it focuses on the idea that, in fact, as teachers, we're kind of evaluating students the whole time. I mean, I think that as teachers, we often just can't help ourselves, that as soon as we go into a classroom, we want to kind of work out who's doing well, who's not doing well, who's strong, whose pronunciation needs work, whose accuracy needs work, who needs to develop their fluency. So these are things that we are thinking the whole time. So we can say that learning-oriented assessment is as much an approach to teaching and learning as it is an approach to assessment. So it's the kind of teaching and learning where you're very, very focused on your learners' needs and you're listening carefully to the language that they're producing in order to determine their needs. And obviously this is very, very relevant when we're thinking about the assessment of speaking. So what I want to do now, having looked at LOA and classroom-based assessment, so let's just look at some of the things that we might be focusing on when you are assessing a learner's speaking. So what are some of the features or components of effective speaking? So what I'm going to do is there's a series of slides, and there's a question that you will see on the left-hand side, and there is an A or B answer, okay? And so what you need to do is answer the question on the left-hand side with A or B. There's a word or a phrase. I think it'll become fairly obvious. And we'll move through these, given that I can't see your answers, but I want to move through these quite quickly because it's there's a series of tasks. I think there's about 6 of them, but they're very, very simple. So, can the learner maintain a good flow of spoken language and get their ideas across? So is that A, fluency, or B, organization? So I would see that as fluency. So the next one, is it easy to follow what the student is saying? Are the ideas connected in a logical way? Are linking words and phrases used to help the listener? So is that interaction strategies or is it organization? I'll pause so that you've got a moment to think. And I would say that that is organization. Number 3, are grammar and vocabulary used correctly and appropriately? So here, does this refer to range or accuracy? I think the word correct gives the game away, so that's B, accuracy. So the next one, 4, is the speaking easy to understand? Are sounds, stresses, and pausing clear? So here are we talking about accuracy or pronunciation? I think the answer to that one's fairly easy. It is indeed pronunciation. Number 5, does the learner use a good variety of grammar and vocabulary? So here we're talking about range, the student's range of language, or their fluency. So the answer here is range. And the final one, does the learner communicate well when speaking to other people. So pronunciation or interaction strategies. Again, I think the answer to that one is fairly easy. Okay, so I have in fact summarized these here. So if we're assessing speaking, what are we assessing? And I think that assessing effective speaking involves an ability to, well, students' ability to speak fluently and communicate well, fluency, organize the spoken language so it is coherent and cohesive, organization, use grammar and vocabulary accurately and appropriately, so that's accuracy, use phonology to make language clear and interesting. Interesting, that refers to intonation, okay, varying pitch and using pausing. Use a wide range of grammar and vocabulary appropriately, range. Deploy strategies that allow the speaker to engage well with other speakers, interaction strategies. So we move from that to this checklist that when we're assessing our learners speaking, we are normally assessing some or all of these features of spoken language in relation to a specified level of competence. So if we're looking at someone's fluency, we don't just look at it in terms of, if we're looking at a learner's fluency, we don't just look at it in terms of fluency in general or in relation to native speaker fluency, but probably we would think, how fluent is this learner given that they are at elementary level? Or how fluent is this learner given that they are at upper intermediate level, for example? Because obviously our expectations are going to be different according to the level. So as I've indicated here, we will be looking at some or all of them. So what I actually want to focus on in the next few slides, again, there's a kind of a mini task where you're selecting a word, is the sum, where we're perhaps not looking at all the features of spoken language, given different kind of speaking activities that we might be getting learners to do. So what I'd like you to do here, so if students, as you can see, number one, it says presentation. If students are doing a presentation, an oral presentation, which feature of spoken language of ABCD on the right might you emphasize not most, but less when they're doing this speaking activity, a presentation? So will you be less focused on organization, pronunciation, interaction strategies, or range? So I would say interaction strategies, because normally in a presentation, the student is probably speaking on their own to a group, to a small group. So the next one, what would you be perhaps focused on less with a role play, if the students are doing a role play? So have a think about that. So I personally would be less focused on organization, because I think that the interaction, accuracy, and range are important in the role play. The other reason I would say organization is because it is a role play, often, and students are having to interact with each other, with an interlocutor, it's often difficult to organize your spoken language when you actually have to fit in with another person. I mean, you can to a certain degree, but it does become much harder. So perhaps I would be less exacting in my assessment of organization in a role play scenario. And then the final one, a group discussion. So would you be less focused on accuracy, fluency, pronunciation, or interaction strategies? So have a think about that. So again, this is just my opinion, you may disagree with me. I tend to be less focused on accuracy. I think in a group discussion, I want students to be speaking fluently, communicating with each other. I'm much more focused on their interaction and their interaction strategies, turn taking, interrupting, that kind of thing, and actually using pronunciation in order to do that, using stress and emphasis and intonation. So I myself would be slightly less focused on their accuracy. So the point I guess I'm making here is that I think it's quite normal that when students are using different genre in a speaking assessment, that we as teachers are more or less focused on different features of spoken language. I mean, yes, we will have them all in the back of our minds to some degree, but I think that it's kind of normal and, dare I say, human for us to be more focused on some features rather than others, given the genre. The other thing that might change the kind of focus that we might have is the actual context of the assessment. So the physical context might actually have some kind of bearing on that. I mean, if you're having to do it in your classroom and it's very noisy, that might determine what you're more or less focused on. Or the context might involve the fact that you can actually work with a colleague, and the colleague can work as the interlocutor, and you can work as the rater. So if you have the benefit of being able to do that, dare I say the luxury, that means that you can perhaps be slightly more comprehensive in terms of the different features that you're going to listen for. But what I think that this does show, that I think that if you're going to be more or less focused on certain aspects of spoken language, it is important that you do assess learners across a range of genre. So I don't think it would be fair to just get students to do an oral presentation and to make an evaluation of their assessment one way or another on the basis of the presentation alone, because that doesn't really give learners an opportunity to demonstrate that they are good at interaction strategies. So what I'd like to do is sort of come back to the beginning, to the when and how, and look at what I would call a kind of a, given my, in the years that I've been teaching, this has been quite a common or typical scenario in terms of assessment of speaking. In a lot of institutions, I think that it happens at set times. Learners carry out an assessment task, monologue, pair work, a small group discussion. Assessment tasks are usually predetermined by the institution. They usually, and I mean, they do this to make your job easier. You listen and evaluate, and you perhaps give feedback and maybe even a grade. But I think that there are some kind of issues associated with that scenario. In my experience, I found that sometimes assessment tasks don't actually match the course content. The tasks often don't give students the opportunity to demonstrate that they have made progress. And often, in some cases, often the tasks are too easy, and they don't give me an idea of what their future needs are. Often the administration of these speaking tests can be quite tricky, because in effect you actually have to give away a lesson in order to conduct the speaking test. So you might take students into another room, and in the meantime students are, I don't know, having to do some kind of reading or maybe some kind of grammar exercise while you sort of take them out to test them, in pairs or in groups of 3 or something. The other thing that I've always found quite challenging is that the assessment situation is ephemeral. It's here and then it's gone. So it's very, very difficult to note down a lot of examples of language. But the key thing is that learners, if they know that they're being assessed, that their speaking is being assessed, they just get incredibly nervous, and more often than not, they don't do very well because they are just so nervous, because they know that that this is a speaking test. So given these issues, I kind of thought about LOA, learning oriented assessment, and I began to kind of think about the assessment of speaking and the when and the how from an LOA perspective. So LOA is suggesting really that we should be assessing students speaking all of the time. Just about every time that we're in the classroom, we're kind of tuned into to learners speaking in that way. And that in doing so, we should be consistently making a note of the strengths and weaknesses, and in particular, the developing needs of students, what they need to focus on next in terms of their learning. And then the teacher decides on the future needs and of the group, and that way you're kind of directing their learning in a very kind of constructive way. So in my school, previously, we had an assessment scenario very similar to the one that I showed you 2 slides ago. So what I did was I tried an experiment with a B1 level class that I taught recently, and I decided to apply some of the principles of LOA to try and change the way that I manage the assessment of speaking. So this is we're now into the final part of the webinar where I want to share this experiment with you. So what I did is I used typical speaking tasks like role play, group discussion, but I made sure that they did relate to the content that we had studied. And in fact, I was using Cambridge English and Power, one of the course books that I worked on, and I adapted some of the course book activities in order to create speaking tasks that I could use for assessment. So I worked out a monologue, a role play, a group discussion, but they did connect quite specifically to the content of the course book. And the key thing is that I administered these speaking tasks across a week. Previously, testing had always been on a Friday, and throughout the week, students would become increasingly more nervous because they knew that the speaking test was due on Friday. The other thing that I did, I used technology a little bit. I'm going to explain in more detail exactly what I did and how I used technology. But this is an interesting quote from Go and Burns, their book on teaching speaking, which says that recording task performance on audio or video is a more reliable way of conducting the assessment. It has the advantage of allowing the teacher to revisit the performance at a later time and also to involve other assessors in the assessment. And I agree with that. So it is much easier to go back and listen for specific language features that they are producing or maybe not producing. And it's easier for you to collect examples of good language as well as errors. However, it's kind of like marking written work. It does take a little bit of time. So you have to go through and listen to all the audio files. So now to kind of drill down to the nitty-gritty of what I did in practice. So I told students that there would be no test on Friday, and they were very happy about that. And I spread 3 speaking tasks across the week. I use technology. Learners recorded and uploaded their monologue. And the other thing is, although I had these 3 speaking tasks, I made a point of being very alert to learners speaking outside the 3 tasks. So for me, it became a focus for the week. And I made notes throughout the week. So in terms of how I managed these 3 speaking tasks, the monologue, students recorded and uploaded it. If you're thinking of doing this, one very strong suggestion I would make to you is make sure that students do this during class time, because if you let them do it as homework, they say, oh, we can do it at homework and then send you the audio file. What happens is they tend to script what they want to say. They write it down and then just read it aloud, which in effect is not really an assessment of their speaking. So in order to do the recording, I just got students to use their smartphones, and then they could quite easily email the file, the audio file, to me. For the role play, I got learners to practice in pairs, and I made sure that they took both roles in the role play. Then the thing that I did that was a little bit different, I got them to perform for the whole group. So by getting each individual pair to perform for the whole group, I could actually hear them far more clearly. It is important to let learners know that you're going to do this and they'll be okay about doing that. And I think this group were. And I think the thing that convinced them is they could see that everybody was going to have a turn at performing their role play for the group as a whole. I think it becomes problematic if you're just choosing two pairs and they kind of feel picked on. But if everyone knows that they're going to have a turn, it feels more sort of democratic, and I think they're more comfortable about that. And it also helped me to give some kind of immediate feedback. I did actually give feedback on sort of strengths and weaknesses, because the good thing is that they'd heard each other. So when I was commenting on specific language examples that were good or perhaps that needed work, everyone had actually heard those, and they knew what I was talking about. The discussion activity that I did, the third speaking task, was I gave them time to think about the topic and prepare. I just monitored and observed, and I was very, very focused on their interactive strategies when they were carrying out the discussion, and also on their fluency and their ability to get across ideas. In order to keep the discussion going, at a certain point, I moved students around and mixed them into new groups so that they picked up the discussion. And that gave me an opportunity to hear plenty of language examples. So as I said, I didn't do the monologue, the role play, and the discussion on the one day. I think I did the monologue on the Monday, Wednesday, and a Friday. So I spread them across the week. But then, you know, throughout the week, and there were other speaking activities that students were doing, and I did listen quite carefully to their language and made notes during that time. So the outcome, as a result of this experiment, I felt that I did have a broader view of learners' speaking ability than just from a one-off test. I certainly managed to get far more samples of their language, both their strengths and weaknesses. And that actually did give me a clear idea in terms of what to prioritize in the next phase of the course. I also felt a little bit more confident about linking my own personal day-to-day evaluation of learners speaking to my overall impressions. And then the key thing is the students were far, far more relaxed with this approach. And at the end of the week, I asked them the first time I did it, I asked them how they felt about it. And they were very enthusiastic. They much preferred this approach. So throughout the term with that particular group of learners, I maintained that same approach. I was also able to give more detailed feedback to learners, and I followed those up with tutorials. So this screen here just shows you feedback under two features. There were more than that, but there's not enough room on the slide for everything. So this particular learner, in terms of her speaking, she had a real problem with pronunciation, but in particular, her ability to produce clear sounds. As I note at the bottom, her intonation, in fact, was quite good, but she actually was very, very difficult to understand because she had problems with sounds, and in particular consonant sounds. So I was able to give her some kind of specific examples, and I picked those up both in her monologue, but also in her role play. So if you're going to try something like this kind of LOA informed approach to assessing speaking, three key things to bear in mind. Just think about any criteria. If you are working in an institution with assessment criteria, bear those in mind as you're assessing. And then also always remember the kind of level of language competence that you're dealing with. So in my case, it was B1 level. So although you're kind of focused on individual words, sounds, errors, strengths, etc., you also need to keep these broader issues in the back of your mind. The other thing is that with classroom-based assessment, and particularly if you're getting recordings, it's really, really useful if you can have standardization and sharing your experience with colleagues. And I mean, that is certainly one of the advantages of recording students from time to time, because then with maybe a small group of you, you can listen to that and then discuss individual strengths and weaknesses. So that acts as a kind of an informal standardization. But the key thing is it's, really it's important to be constantly and consistently evaluating your learner's spoken language. And that really is what an LOA, learning oriented assessment approach to teaching, is all about. So we've got 5 minutes left for questions, and I'll just put those references up on screen so that you can make a note of them if you are interested. So as I've said, Simon, I can't actually see any questions, but if
That's
you,
fine. I've got them here. Yeah.
cool,
Thank
great.
you. Thanks a lot for that, Craig. That's great. Yeah, let's just start off with a couple here. We've got just a few minutes left. So, one question here from Iman. Can you give us applicable activities or tasks that suit students who will be assessed for the first time?
Um, I so
Or
for
maybe even
example, I think,
advice or something like that. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I I would, for example, I don't think I would give them a monologue, a presentation to do the first time. I think sort of role plays. I wouldn't have a large group discussion, a kind of a small group discussion of some kind. Um, and if you want students just to speak on their own, I would perhaps maybe as a teacher the very first time lead that a little bit so that you actually provide them with questions. The other key thing is make sure that you're dealing with topics that students are familiar with, obviously things that they've studied already on the course. And again, if you can possibly, I realize that in a lot of contexts, it perhaps won't be possible. If you can spread things out so that they don't have kind of an assessment day or an assessment lesson, that certainly for the very first time will perhaps take a little bit of pressure off. So you do a little bit one day, a little bit the next day, etc. So those are the kinds of things that I would get them to do. So things that they're familiar with, topics that they're familiar with, things which are probably more interactive and they can actually support and help each other.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. So another question here for ESP. Do you think it's appropriate to comment on how effective a learner's speech might be in completing a task in a professional context, especially with regards to register?
Yes. So I'm not sure what if the professional context would
Yeah,
actually be in the real world or not with their manager there. Um, But absolutely, if someone is on an ESP course, I think that register is part of the kind of accuracy, because if you think that accuracy includes the idea of appropriate language. So, I mean, if you think of someone who's studying medicine, absolutely, you'd be it a nurse or a doctor, and they're being assessed in that way, they should be able to produce language that is suitable for a medical register, because that's part of their kind of professional expertise, but also it allows them to communicate effectively, not only in the test, but obviously in a job like medicine, being a doctor or a nurse, the actual real world stakes are incredibly high. So I think I would say yes, absolutely. It's fair to assess them on their register in that
excellent.
context.
I think we just got time for one more, just looking down the list here. What would be the correct percentage of speaking that teachers should manage in class? So I guess it's from when students are speaking, how much are you assessing all of it? Are you giving them feedback or just now and again, or is it the formative part at the end of the week?
So is that speaking in general or
I think
assess
that,
speaking?
yeah, what would be the correct percentage of speaking that teachers should manage in class? Or maybe actually the amount of speaking in class.
The amount of speaking. That's really hard to answer. Uh, Sort of without thinking of a specific sort of context, I guess. Um, but in my experience, that's often driven not by any kind of rule or regulation, but pretty much by students themselves. So in effect, students often are coming to English language classes in order to be able to speak English. And they will often, and this has happened in schools that I've worked at, that if they feel that their teacher is not giving them enough speaking practice, they usually will complain about it. They will often say, well, we didn't say anything, we didn't get a chance to speak or practice the grammar or the vocabulary that we'd learned. So I think that the answer to that question is often actually driven by learners. It may, of course, change if you are teaching in a specific context where maybe a sort of a university where you actually have to get students to a certain sort of level of competence, and maybe there is a little bit more emphasis on writing and accuracy because it is maybe English for academic purposes. Well, then it could change. So it is very context driven. So it's very difficult to come up with a kind of percentage that works for all contexts. But I think if you're concerned about that, the people that you should ask really are your students. How much do you want to be speaking? Because often when students are speaking is often when they learn the grammar. It's not when they're studying the rules. It's when they're actually trying to put it into practice that they really learn it. So that's always worth sharing.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say the research that we've done here, students will measure their progress by how they can speak. So obviously they need feedback as well, once they have spoken. So that's all we've got time for, Craig. Thank you very much indeed for that. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and thanks everyone for attending. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you'll receive an email in a few days, and that will have your certificate of attendance and a link to this webinar so you can watch it again if there's any bits that you've missed. And I'd just like to plug one thing before you leave. Between the 29th and the 31st of October, there's a series of free webinars. This is the Academic ELT Online Conference that Cambridge are running, and we'll put up a link now, but I'll read it out as well. If you want to check out, there's I think 7 different speakers on all different kinds of academic. This is academic English. Then please visit cambridge.org/academic-english, and you'll see on there a little box that you click on, and you can register for the talks. You can read about the people talking, all our speakers that we have. So that's the end of October, and go and visit cambridge.org/academic-english. But back to Craig, thank you very much for that. Excellent as always, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for joining in, and have a good day.